Today, we are going to talk about rebelling against God, being disobedient against God, and how this rebellion is rooted in unbelief. And I'm going to prove this to you by a little gem of a scripture that I came across yesterday. First of all, failing to trust God's promises leads to disobedience. Let me read that again. Failing to trust God's promises leads to us disobeying Him. And it prevents us from experiencing the spiritual rest that God has for us. So yesterday I was reading in Hebrews, and I came to this scripture part and I wrote at some point in my Bible, I've never thought of that. So I read it again. And I was like, why had I never thought of that? Why did I write that? So I started looking up the scripture and seeing what the meaning behind it was. Not just reading it, but looking it up and learning more about it so I could find the meaning of it. So I am in Hebrews 3:16 through 19. And this is talking about the ancient Israelites who God took out of Egypt. Remember how He took them out of Egypt? Remember how He parted the Red Sea for them? That was a pretty big miracle, right? Remember how He had the manna or the bread come down on them in their camps every single morning so they had enough bread to eat for the day? Kind of a miracle, right? He had the clouds walk over them while they were walking throughout the day so they wouldn't get scorched by the heating sun. Kind of a miracle, isn't it? They were living with God's miracles day after day after day. But here's what God says about that, starting in 16. Who were they who heard and rebelled? Were they not all those Moses led out of Egypt, and with whom He was angry for 40 years? Was it not those who sinned, whose bodies perished in the wilderness? And to whom did God swear that they would never enter His rest, if not to those who disobeyed? And whom did God swear that they would never enter His rest, if not to those who disobeyed? Disobey, you don't enter the rest. So we see that they were not able to enter because of their unbelief. They were not able to enter the promised land, their spiritual resting place, the land of milk and honey, because of their unbelief. Unbelief. God literally parted the sea so they could walk through the sea and get away from the Egyptians, and then put it back over when the Egyptians were in it and drowned them. Literally. And throughout time, because they never got to that promised land, they had unbelief. Where are you right now in your life? What is going on to you right now? Because if you have found this message, something is going on to you right now that you have unbelief. But what I want you to remember is all of the miracles that God did for you before in your past. Miracles that you probably didn't even realize in the moment that they were miracles, but He did them for you. I want you to remember those. Think back on those. And then I want you to think about what is happening right now and how can you change your heart to believe. So I am going to take you over to Psalm 95, 8 through 11, because I'm just going to prove to you a little bit more about this passage and about how angry God was at them. So we are in Psalm 95, 8 through 11, and it mirrors Hebrews 3, 16 through 19. So today, if you would hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as you did at Meribah. I don't know if I'm saying that right. As you did at the day at Massah in the wilderness, where your ancestors tested me. They tried me, though they had seen what I did. For 40 years I was angry with that generation. I said, they are a people whose hearts go astray, and they have not known my ways. They lived through the miracles, and they still didn't know his ways. How angry would you be at your children that they saw that you fed them and clothed them and took care of them every day, yet they said, my parents don't care about me. They didn't provide for me. They didn't do anything for me. How angry would that make you? Now think 100-fold of how angry God was. I said, they are people whose hearts go astray, and they have not known my ways. So I declared an oath in my anger, they shall never enter my rest. The rest was the promised land. So I want to go through I want to go through Hebrews 17 through 19 here really quick. So 17 says, and with whom he was angry for 40 years. Well, who was he angry with? The Israelites. We just learned that in Psalm 95. The Israelites, they chose to rebel after witnessing his miracles. 18 says, and to whom did God swear that they would never enter his rest, if not to those who disobeyed? Disobedience is a fruit of a hardened heart. A hardened heart. The Israelites actively refused to follow God's commands. Do you know that those 40 years in the wilderness, they were literally just walking in circles? They were not very far from the promised land. They could have gotten there in a fourth of that time. Probably less. I don't even know. I don't remember. I've heard about it. But they could have gotten there in like this amount of time, but it took this amount of time because their hearts were hardened. Because God was providing food, yet they were complaining that they only had that food for 40 years. Yes, would that be boring? Yes, it would. Did God provide for them? Yes, he did. Yes, he did. They walked through, and he had a cloud come over them to protect them. He opened the sea for them. But they were complaining because they didn't have these gourmet meals. And they didn't have these nice houses yet. And they didn't have these places. But guess what? If they would have stopped complaining about that and changed their hearts and had a better attitude, they would have entered the promised land. They would have entered it. But they couldn't be patient. They couldn't be obedient. So they didn't enter. The next generation entered, but they didn't get to enter. They all died before they got there. 19. So we see that they were not able to enter because of their unbelief. Just what I said. The Israelites failed not only because they broke the rules, but because they failed to trust God's character and just promises. You see, faith and obedience are linked. And when you have faith and when you have obedience, and I'm going to just add a good attitude, you get the promised land. When you give up on the faith, when you start doing things in your own way instead of His way, you lose out on the promised land. I hope that helps you. I hope you learned something today, and I hope that you will take this and change your way of thinking so that you can finally enter the promised land that you have been praying for.